At a very early age, a cap is put on awareness. And the way the cap is put on awareness against most people is either through their guardian or parents or the ones they look up to, telling them certain things cannot be done, or going into certain things or doing certain things, either through school or not, whereby they cap your awareness by fixing that awareness to something very limited. Some people realize this and try to do better, others not so much. Within those two spectrums, the one that try to do better either tries to do better by all means necessary without using another level of awareness to guide them, whereas out of those group of people who try to also do better, some use another level of awareness to do better in search of their ability to lift that cap off of that initial awareness that's been capped. When one tries to lift the cap of an awareness without knowing that another level of awareness is needed to be layered on top of that, that causes pain and suffering. That causes arbitrary actions. And that requirement of layer of awareness to help overlap or raise the cap of another awareness is no different than the need to hear other people say something that you have an idea of, but you just can't quite put your finger on it until someone else says it in a different way to clarify it for you. That requirement of another type of awareness to use as a means to raise the cap of another awareness is no different than consciousness observing itself. No different than putting a bowl of water and pouring it into another bowl of water. Now, on the other hand of the spectrum, where some don't even know that a cap has been put on their awareness, they themselves become the issue. They themselves become what's spoken of in the ancient world, whereby the wise men and wise women say the worst thing than a tyrant is those who sit there and watch the tyranny take place. Those are usually the other people who don't even know that a cap has been put on their awareness. When it comes to rights, there are different people with those state of mind who come into pen and paper and rights, or its supposition, with those same state of mind. And if one intends to raise their awareness and remove that cap that's been put on them, and remember, awareness comes at different degrees, and awareness is something you can never completely figure out. None of us can. It's a continuous thing. But one thing that has to be kept in mind in the process of peeling up that layer, that cap of awareness that's been conditioned into us one way or the other, you have to challenge your own beliefs, because awareness and the cap of awareness is encased into this thing called belief system. And as we get conditioned into one thing or the other, it creates beliefs, and beliefs is the foundation of imagination. It's the foundation of what you see in your mind. What you see in your mind is what your environment will play out as a reflection. Wonder why this world is screwed up and so-called tyranny is doing so much and all these tortfeasors are comfortable? Because that is an outward reflection of what's in a lot of people's minds in today's world. Keep that in mind as you listen to these things. When it comes to rights, for instance, in this given moment, First Amendment freedom of speech. The past, we've went over cruel and usual punishments, its elements and standards, probable cause elements and standards, how it's defined, its loopholes, and how it's extended when it comes to the legality aspect of it. As much as people might want to run away from the legality of things, law and legal go hand in hand. Legal is the operation of law. Again, the cap of awareness and belief system is the demise that most people run into. When one, in this given instance, say that they have the right to speech, which is in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and, of course, in your respective state constitutions. One says they have the right to speak. Well, what are the criteria to it? Because the criteria are elaborated upon. Many who make reference to the right to speech don't know the details. There are fighting words, there are standards to it as to where that speech can be enforced, and there are exceptions to them. Let's go over those. More specifically, the standards and the exceptions. Perry Education Association Appellant versus Perry Local Educator Association. This is an appeal case. There's the case reference. There's the appeal number. There's the year it was decided. With respect to public property that is not by tradition or government designation a forum for public communication, a state may reserve the use of the property for its intended purpose, communicative or otherwise, as long as a regulation on speech is reasonable and not an effort to suppress expression merely because the public official opposes the speaker's view. In other words, the underlying factor here is there are two types of property. There's public property and there's private property. Specific to public properties, now keep in mind, all governments are no different than businesses. All governments are no different than private entities. Clear from doctrine lets us know that. And besides the whole 28 USC 3002 15A stating that the United States is a federal corporation and all those enclaves that works under it takes on the same status right here. United States means a federal corporation, an agency, department, commission, board, or the entity of the United States, or an instrumentality of the United States. Federal corporation. That. Besides the fact that all those evidence exists, general operation in business is you have the right of interest to operate your business without interruption. Simple as that. So the underlying factor here when it comes to speech, in this case, besides the fact that governmental entities own private properties, the presumption here is dealing with public properties as it relates to those so-called governmental regulations of substantive right in a public place. And what all these legalese just told you is that there are traditional means that properties are used publicly or governmental designation, meaning private regulation of how this same public property can be used, specific in this case to speech. Again, when it comes to speech, freedom of speech, which is the subject matter here, there are two main venues it can be expressed: public venue or private venue. When it comes to public venue, based on the public trust doctrine, the so-called government, to preserve the integrity of the natural resource involved in those public places, they can, quote, regulate it, so long as the people say nothing about it. But if you don't know anything about how they regulate your substantive right, how can you ever say something about it? Hence, we raising the cap of awareness. We speaking about things of this nature, right? Two forms, two venues, public and private. And even when you're in the public, the supposition is that governmental entities, private entities, corporate entities can regulate it. In this case, regulate what? Speech. With respect to public property that is not by tradition or government designation, a forum for public communication, a state may reserve the use of the property for its intended purposes, communicative or otherwise, communicative meaning speech, as long as a regulation on speech is reasonable and not an effort to suppress expression merely because the public official opposes the speaker's view. And freedom of speech is protected based on your prerogative. You can have your own opinion and express it. And the only exception, whereas it can be regulated in a public venue, because of course you have the right to do whatever you want in your own private place of abode, right? So in a public place where others are to be put into consideration for the sake of equity, so that one man's activity would not affect everyone else negatively, just as much as it can then be regulated, so long as it is reasonable and is not for the purpose of suppressing the expression itself based on the perspective and the state of mind of the one who purports to regulate it. And just to ascertain what public venue also constitute, that includes places like sidewalks, normal stuff, right? It goes on here to say the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech applies to, gives examples, teachers' mailboxes as surely as it does elsewhere within the school. The part we're looking for is, and on sidewalks outside. Basic stuff, right? Now, here's the catch. To standard place against so-called government when it comes to regulating these speeches in these specific venues. The same Res Judicata goes on to say, in places which by long tradition, meaning it's well known to not be regulated against the freedom of speech, or it's well known to be regulated to benefit freedom of speech. In places by long tradition or by government fiat have been devoted to assembly or debate, the right of the state to limit expressive activity are sharply circumscribed, meaning when it comes to regulating free speech, the burden is on them heavily when it comes to limiting it. At one end of the spectrum are streets and parks, which, quote, have immemorially been held in trust for the use of the public, and time out of mind have been used for purposes of assembly, communicating thoughts between citizens, and discussing public questions. See the reason why people can go on highways and stop traffic despite it being dangerous? The reason why people can go in places and just all of a sudden create crowd and there's really nothing that can be done about it, believe it or not, part of it is because of public trust doctrine. And that's basically what it's telling you here. At one end of the spectrum are streets and parks which have immemorially been held in trust for the use of the public. Remember, we're still speaking of speech here. And time out of mind have been used for purpose of assembly, right to assemble. Communicating speech, communicating thoughts between citizens and discussing public questions. In these quintessential public forums, the government may not prohibit all communicative activity. For the state to enforce a content-based exclusion, it must show that its regulation is necessary to serve a compelling state interest, and that it is narrowly drawn to achieve that end. Meaning, even if body politics say, okay, we now want to regulate speech and public forums, which have immemorially been held in trust for the use of publics for the purpose of communicating and assembly, and to express the same among one another in whatever form they choose, so long as it doesn't disturb the public peace, right? So let's just say maybe it does somehow disturb public peace. Even then, that interest of theirs of, quote, public peace, because now they want to use this public trust doctrine here as a double-edged sword to say, well, we're here to protect it. So now we have a compelling state interest to protect it. And even then, it must still be narrowly drawn to achieve that end, meaning they have strict manner in which they can limit speech. The state may also enforce regulations of the time, place, and manner of expression, which are content neutral, meaning your subjective feelings about what the other man or woman is saying should not be the influence of why you are regulating, of why that speech is being regulated. The state may also enforce regulation of time, place, and manner of expression, which are content neutral, are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. Again, narrowly, they keep using this term narrow. They're qualifying to let you know, even though they can, you have to know your rights, that there is strict limitation as to how and why they can limit the time, place, and manner of expression of speech, which is immemorially accepted to be something basic, preserved by the people unto the people, and leave open ample alternative channel of communication, meaning it is the liability of anyone intending to suppress your speech, to give you a way out or alternative means to still communicate. So they cannot just completely suppress it and say you can't say this without any other option. If they're saying you can't speak one way or the other or do one thing, well, where's the alternative means? If you're not providing alternative means, then that's an issue. That's an abrogation of a basic preserved thing that ought not to have taken place. This option way out is what they call intermediate scrutiny. So there are two main types of standard when it comes to the burden that any body politic has when they try to limit speech or regulate speech. One is intermediate scrutiny, and second is strict scrutiny. Kind of like you would have standard elements and tests to qualify if you want to bring malicious prosecution, defamation, battery, undue burden, all that. Certain things you have to meet in order to be able to invoke certain things. Well, there is that on the end of representatives of body politics if they want to limit certain rights. In this case, the First Amendment, speech. The First Amendment speaks of many, many different things. One of them in this case is speech. And there are two main standards. They call it the intermediate scrutiny and the strict scrutiny. What we've just went over is called the intermediate scrutiny, whereby they can try to limit it, but even then they're very limited to how they can limit that speech of yours. And when they do somehow manage to somehow limit that speech of yours, it has to be content neutral, and they must provide an alternative form of communication where that speech cannot be muted. And that is the most lenient way to which they are allowed to limit your speech. The second standard is an arrest for the called Ward versus Rock against racism. This was decided in the year 1989 at the Supreme Court level. Supreme Court case number 88-226. Of course, this is the United States Supreme Court, federal level. The primary holding: the government does not need to choose the least restrictive alternative. Remember, during the intermediate scrutiny, if they attempt to regulate speech, it has to be content neutral. It cannot be based on the content of what you're saying, aka the subject matter. And two, if they do somehow try to limit it based on the time, place, or however else, they have to provide you an alternative means, meaning they cannot mute your speech in any way. This elaborates on the details and goes on to speak about the extent to which that alternative means can be enforced. The government does not need to choose the least restrictive alternative and imposing time, place, and manner restriction on speech. So what in the world does this actually mean? I give you a summary. New York City imposed regulation on the use of the bandshell in Central Park, seeking to control the sound volume of concerts there. The city provides sound amplification equipment and a sound technician for the performer to use, and they were required to use them. Rock Against Racism was a performance group that was the main reason for the complaint that gave rise to the regulation, meaning someone was too loud, right? It argued that they were invalid under the First Amendment. The requirement for time, place, and manner regulation in a public forum are that they must be content neutral in the subject matter, be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, meaning if they want to limit it, they are limited from the bounds of how they can limit it for the purpose of their interest, and alternative channels for communicating the same content, meaning if they somehow prevent you from communicating one way or the other, a solution still has to be provided so that you are not muted from expressing yourself through speech. Noise control has no connection to content, so the regulation of content neutral. And the government has a significant interest in controlling noise pollution. The regulation is narrowly tailored to this interest, which would not have been achieved otherwise. Meaning, part of how they can regulate speech is how loud it is for the purpose of others. Just one example. Less restrictive but still effective alternatives exist. So this regulation is not narrowly tailored and thus invalid. The concept of time, place, and manner regulations advanced by this decision suggests that the government needs to show only that a regulation advances its interest in some ways, even if this results in a prior restraint of speech. The conception of time, place, and manner regulations advanced by this decision suggests that the government need to show only that a regulation advances its interest in some ways, even if this results in a prior restraint of speech. Here is a loophole. There was no substantial burden here, since the concert still could continue with adequate equipment and the restriction was content neutral. It was justifiable for the city to prevent the sound from interfering with people in quieter surrounding area. And then public trust doctrine, for the benefit of other people. In other words, if you want to claim any substantive right, there's something called substantial burden. You've probably heard in the middle of these words in this video or other videos where it's spoken of regarding undue burden. It's the same thing. In order for you to really remove any options of exception on their end, you have to say that whatever it is that they've done creates a substantial or undue burden against you and your basic rights. Because that would always be the loophole that they would use. And that loophole is, well, you didn't claim that it was our decision was a burden to you. You didn't tell us at that moment, and you're still not claiming it. So, oh well, we could have done it. Instead of just saying, well, what you're saying or what you're doing is wrong. You can't do that. That's what a lot of people do. A lot of people look at what they're doing or what they can't do. What about you? How has that affected you negatively? That's what you should be proving. Begin by claiming that whatever they've done has created a burden on you. That's how you begin. Because you are the center of attraction of your universe. You are the center of attraction of your rights. And that is where it begins. If you're speaking of your rights and you're pointing at them, looking at them, something is wrong. It would always come back to you. It will always come back to its source. And has the source been damaged somehow? Because the physical or emotional damage is not just the only thing. The rights themselves can be damaged. Did you know that? So, claim substantial or undue burden. In summary, there are different venues that certain rights can be invoked. And when there is intervention by other body politic, there are standards. Just like you have standards to be able to prove something, they have it also. When it comes to First Amendment speech, you cannot be muted. And if they do somehow attempt to mute you, they have to provide an alternative means. And that alternative means must be based on a public trust doctrine. It's basically everything that's being spoken of here. And overall, there's always a loophole. You always have to claim substantial burden or undue burden. Otherwise, they will ride the public trust doctrine all the way home. Till next time, take care. Best of luck. Hey, I'm inviting you to join my Patreon. Over there, we speak about things that we don't speak of on YouTube. We speak about trust-related matters and other subtle details regarding the property and asset protection. We speak about financial-related matters and a lot of things that people seek and can't quite put their hands on or get a better understanding of. We speak about child support, privacy, things of spiritual nature, subtle arts of suing and whatnot, discharge, and much more. Take a look at it. Take care. Best of luck.